Somewhere in the historical record, there is a naval battle that almost nobody talks about. Ships clashed, men died, and the outcome may have reshuffled the balance of power across an entire region. And yet, if you search for it in the standard textbooks, you will find almost nothing. A footnote here, a passing reference there, and then silence. That absence is the mystery. We tend to assume that history remembers what matters. The great battles get the monuments, the chapters, the films. Trafalgar gets Nelson dying dramatically on the quarterdeck. Midway gets the turning point narrative, the decisive moment that changed the Pacific. But history is not simply a record of what happened. It is a record of what people decided to write down, preserve, repeat, and teach. And that process has always involved choices, sometimes deliberate ones. So what happens when a major naval engagement simply does not make the cut? That is exactly the question driving everything you're about to hear. There was a battle, a genuine large-scale collision of fleets that appears to have influenced trade routes, sharpened imperial ambitions, and possibly rewritten naval doctrine for the powers involved. Commanders made decisions under fire that their successors studied. The outcome shifted, which flags flew over, which stretches of coastline. And yet, somewhere between the engagement itself and the history books that came after, the story got lost. Or did it get removed? That distinction matters enormously, and it is one we are going to keep pressing throughout this investigation. There is a difference between a battle that fades through neglect, simply outcompeted for attention by larger conflicts and more famous names, and a battle that someone at some level preferred not to emphasize. One is the ordinary entropy of history. The other is something more deliberate and more troubling. The tension runs through every layer of the evidence. Official records from the period tell one story, often sanitized, often shaped by the political needs of whoever commissioned them. Later historians working from those same records inherited the gaps without always questioning them. And popular history, which tends to compress and dramatize, almost never reaches down far enough to rescue a battle that was never celebrated to begin with. Here is what we are going to do. We are going to reconstruct the world that made this battle possible. The rivalries, the ambitions, the specific stretch of water where it all came to a head. We are going to walk through the engagement itself, as closely as the surviving sources allow, and look honestly at what those sources leave out. Then we are going to ask the harder question, why does a battle with real consequences end up absent from the story we tell ourselves about that era? The answers, as it turns out, are not simple. They involve the way governments manage defeat, the way historians inherit assumptions, and the way certain names and certain nations tend to crowd out everything else in the historical frame. But before any of that, there is a more immediate question worth sitting with. If this battle genuinely shaped the world that came after it, what else might be missing from the history we think we know? That is not a comfortable thought. It is, however, a useful one. And it is exactly where we need to start. To understand why this battle happened at all, you need to step back from the ships and the commanders and look at the larger map, not just the geographic map, but the political one. Because this was not a fight that emerged from nowhere. It grew out of years of mounting pressure, competing ambitions, and a regional order that had been quietly straining at its seams long before the first cannon was loaded. The era surrounding this battle was one of those periods where multiple powers were simultaneously expanding and simultaneously running into each other. Empires and kingdoms that had once operated at a comfortable distance were now close enough to compete directly for ports, for trade routes, for the loyalty of smaller states caught in between. That kind of pressure does not usually produce a single dramatic confrontation right away. It produces a slow accumulation of grievances, proxy conflicts, and near misses, until eventually the conditions for a full collision are in place. By the time the fleets actually met, anyone paying attention would have recognized that something major was coming. The surprise was not the battle itself. The surprise, perhaps, was how quickly it dropped out of the conversation afterward. What each side stood to gain was not abstract. The powers involved were not fighting over ideology or prestige alone, though both of those were certainly present. They were fighting over something far more tangible, the ability to move goods, armies, and information across water faster and more reliably than their rivals. Control of key sea lanes meant that a merchant fleet could operate under protection rather than threat. It meant that a military force could be resupplied and reinforced. It meant that smaller ports and coastal settlements along the disputed region would align themselves with whichever power seemed capable of guaranteeing their safety and of punishing disloyalty. That last point deserves emphasis, because it explains something about the scale of the stakes. Naval dominance in this context was not just a military advantage. It was a form of political leverage that cascaded through the entire regional system. The states and trading communities that lined the relevant coastlines were not passive observers. They were calculating actors who understood very well that their own prosperity and survival depended on picking the right patron, or at least on not visibly backing the wrong one. When the great powers moved toward confrontation, these smaller players were watching extremely carefully. A naval victory could shift allegiances across dozens of ports almost overnight. A defeat could undo years of diplomatic work in a single afternoon. The economic pressures pushing toward conflict were real and growing. Both primary powers had commitments that required revenue, and revenue increasingly flowed through maritime commerce. Customs duties, transit fees, the taxation of merchant vessels passing through controlled waters. These were not peripheral concerns, but central to how states funded their ambitions. When a rival power began extending its influence over the same waters, it was not merely a strategic annoyance. It was a direct threat to the fiscal machinery of the state. Rival alliances deepened this pressure further, because each bloc had clients and obligations that made backing down politically costly, even when the immediate military calculus might have counselled patience. There had also been prior conflicts, earlier clashes, skirmishes and disputes that had not resolved the underlying competition, but had instead sharpened it. Each previous engagement had produced grievances, humiliations and lessons. Commanders and admirals on both sides had studied what had gone wrong in earlier encounters and had made adjustments. They had altered their fleet compositions, revised their tactical doctrines, and in some cases rebuilt alliances specifically to correct the weaknesses that earlier fighting had exposed. This battle, in other words, was not a first meeting between strangers. It was more like a reckoning between adversaries who had been circling each other for a long time and had finally run out of room to keep circling. What made the specific timing so charged was a convergence of factors that, in retrospect, made a large-scale confrontation almost inevitable within a fairly narrow window. Both powers had reached a point where delay meant disadvantage. The balance of forces was close enough that neither side could afford to let the other consolidate further. External pressures, rival powers watching from the margins, potential allies weighing their options, created a kind of strategic clock that was running out for both sides simultaneously. Waiting was no longer a safe strategy. Acting carried risk, but inaction carried what may have felt like a greater one. For people living through this period, the idea that a major naval battle was approaching would not have seemed remote or theoretical. It would have seemed like the obvious destination of a road that had been clearly visible for years. Merchants adjusted their shipping routes. Coastal fortifications were reinforced. Diplomatic correspondence from the period, where it survives, carries a consistent undercurrent of anticipation and unease. Officials on both sides were writing about fleet readiness, about supply chains, about the reliability of Allied commanders, the kind of detailed operational preparation that only makes sense if you genuinely expect to fight, and soon. This is what often gets lost when a battle drops out of the historical record, the sense of how seriously contemporaries took it. When later generations fail to find the battle in their textbooks, there is a temptation to assume it must not have been that significant, that perhaps it was more of a skirmish than a showdown. But that reasoning runs backward. The scale of the preparations, the weight of the interests involved, and the political geography that made this particular stretch of water so consequential all point towards something that the people living through it understood to be a major event. They were not wrong. The battle that followed justified their concern, which makes the subsequent silence all the more striking. Because if this confrontation was the product of years of building tension, if it was anticipated, prepared for, and understood as potentially decisive by the people closest to it, then its near disappearance from later history is not simply a case of it being forgotten. Something more specific happened to the memory of this battle. And to understand what that was, we first need to understand exactly why the water where it was fought mattered so much, and why that geography made the stakes, for everyone involved, genuinely difficult to walk away from. So let us look at the map, and really look at it the way an admiral or a merchant captain would have looked at it, with the kind of attention that comes from knowing your life and your livelihood depend on reading it correctly. The waters where this battle took place were not simply a backdrop. They were, in a very real sense, the reason the battle happened at all. Geography here was not passive. It was an active force that shaped decisions, constrained options, and concentrated power in ways that made conflict almost structurally inevitable. To understand the battle, you first have to understand why this particular body of water had accumulated so much strategic weight over such a long period of time. Start with location. The stretch of water in question sat at the intersection of multiple major routes, the kind of natural crossroads that does not appear often on a maritime map. To the north, overland routes fed into coastal ports where goods were transshipped onto vessels. To the south, open water connected to broader trading networks that extended across regions. What this created was a funnel effect. Ships moving in almost any commercially or militarily significant direction eventually passed through, or needed to pass through, this same relatively confined corridor. Control of that corridor was not one advantage among many. It was the advantage, the one that made everything else either possible or impossible. The physical geography reinforced this concentration. Choke points defined the approaches, narrow straits and shallow headlands where deep water navigation was restricted to a handful of channels. A fleet holding those passages could dictate terms to any vessel that wished to pass. A fleet that lost them had to either fight its way through, or accept a vastly longer and more exposed alternative route that added weeks to any voyage and multiplied the risks of storm, supply exhaustion, and ambush. Neither side was willing to accept that trade-off, which is part of why the strategic logic kept pushing both powers back toward the same contested ground. The currents running through this area deserve particular attention, because they were not neutral. Prevailing flows ran in patterns that could accelerate or impede a sailing fleet, depending on the season, the wind, and the precise heading a commander chose to take. An experienced navigator who understood those currents could exploit them for speed or concealment. A commander who misjudged them could find his fleet strung out at precisely the wrong moment, individual ships arriving out of position and unable to support each other effectively. Seasonal wind patterns layered additional complexity onto this picture. There were windows during the year when certain passages were reliably open, and others when they became genuinely treacherous. And both sides understood this calendar well. The timing of military operations in this region was always, to a significant degree, dictated by the sea itself. The coastal terrain added another dimension. The shoreline was not a clean, open edge. It was broken by inlets, offshore islands and promontories that created natural anchorages on one hand and ambush positions on the other. A smaller fleet with knowledge of those inlets could survive against a larger force by refusing to engage in open water and instead using the coastline as cover. Conversely, a fleet that could position itself off a key promontory could effectively seal off an entire section of coast from resupply and reinforcement. Local knowledge was not incidental here. It was a genuine tactical asset, and both sides worked hard to cultivate navigators and pilots who understood the specific peculiarities of these waters. All of this physical geography translated directly into economic and political significance. The trade moving through this region was not marginal traffic. It included goods that supplied entire inland regions, and more importantly, it included the revenue streams that funded the competing powers' military and administrative structures. Customs posts and transit fees collected from merchant vessels passing through controlled waters were, in this period, genuinely important fiscal resources. When one power's fleet extended its reach into waters previously dominated by a rival, it was not simply projecting military strength. It was reaching into that rival's treasury. Losing dominance over this corridor meant losing revenue, and losing revenue meant eventually losing the capacity to project power anywhere. The communication dimension mattered just as much. Military dispatches, diplomatic correspondence, and instructions to distant governors and commanders all travelled by sea in this era. A power that controlled these waters could intercept, delay, or monitor its rivals' communications, while keeping its own secure. That kind of information advantage was extraordinarily difficult to quantify, but fundamentally important to how strategy unfolded across the broader theatre. It is one reason why both sides invested so heavily in maintaining a credible naval presence here, even during periods when direct military confrontation was not imminent. Presence itself was a form of strategic communication. For both powers, then, this stretch of water was genuinely indispensable, not in the loose rhetorical sense that strategic analysts sometimes use that word, but in a literal operational sense. Neither side had a satisfactory alternative. Neither could simply route around it. And that mutual recognition of irreplaceability is precisely what made the location so dangerous, because it meant that neither power could afford to simply monitor the situation and wait. Every month that passed without resolution was a month in which the other side might consolidate its position. The geography that made this water so valuable also made compromise over it extraordinarily difficult to sustain. There is one final point worth raising here, and it connects to something larger. Geography shapes not just battles, but the memory of battles. Conflicts that occur in locations that remain strategically significant tend to attract continued historical attention. The battle of a famous strait, a renowned harbour, an iconic peninsula, these retain a kind of gravitational pull in historical writing because the place itself never stops being relevant. But when the strategic logic of a region shifts, when new technology, new trade routes, or new political configurations render a formerly critical stretch of water less central, the battles fought there can lose their anchor in the present. They start to feel like disputes over something that no longer matters, that may be part of what happened here. The water was real. The stakes were real. But whether the world that made those stakes legible survived long enough to keep the battle in view, that is a question that will follow us through everything that comes next. Geography shapes the stakes, but it is the men and the machines that determine what actually happens when those stakes are contested. By the time both sides began positioning their forces, each had a commander whose reputation carried real weight, the kind of weight that affects how subordinates follow orders, how enemies calculate risk, and how historians later assign credit or blame. On one side stood a figure who had built his career through a combination of operational experience and political acumen. He was not simply a sailor who had risen through merit. He understood the relationship between naval command and court influence, and he had cultivated both with considerable care. His captains respected him, though respect is not quite the same as trust, and the distinction mattered. He was known to make decisive calls quickly, sometimes too quickly for the officers around him, who occasionally felt consulted less than they wished to be. His strengths and his weaknesses were, in a sense, the same thing. The commander on the opposing side carried a different kind of reputation. Where the first admiral was associated with speed and boldness, this one was regarded as methodical, patient, and difficult to unsettle. His experience had been shaped by a different set of engagements, smaller actions, coastal operations, and the logistical management of extended campaigns at sea, the unglamorous work of keeping a fleet supplied and coherent over months rather than days. He had never commanded in a battle of this scale. Whether that was a liability or simply an open question was something his enemies debated and his supporters dismissed. What both sides agreed on was that he was not the sort of man to be rattled by an unexpected development, which was, depending on how you read it, either reassuring or dangerous. Neither commander entered this battle entirely free, to act as he judged best. Both operated under political constraints that shaped their options in ways that are easy to overlook when the focus stays on tactics and ship counts. One faced pressure from above to achieve a decisive result quickly. A prolonged campaign was fiscally difficult and politically inconvenient for the government that had authorized it. The other operated under instructions that were in certain respects contradictory. He was expected to protect the fleet as a strategic asset, while simultaneously using it aggressively enough to produce a result that would satisfy his sponsors. The tension between fleet preservation and fleet employment is a recurring theme in naval history, and both commanders here felt some version of it. Turn now to the fleets themselves, because the hardware and the men who operated it tell a story that the commanders' biographies alone cannot. The First Fleet was larger in total ship count and carried more raw firepower on its heaviest vessels. Its principal warships were purpose-built for line engagement, designed to absorb punishment and deliver broadsides at close to medium range. The crews on these ships were by and large experienced, and the gunnery standards were regarded as solid, though not exceptional. What this fleet lacked was versatility in its lighter elements. The smaller, faster vessels that performed reconnaissance, screened the main force, and pursued fleeing enemies after an engagement were fewer in number and, by several accounts, not particularly well coordinated with the capital ships. The fleet was powerful in a concentrated engagement. It was less effective when conditions pushed toward dispersal and pursuit. The Second Fleet presented a genuinely different profile. It was smaller overall, but the difference was less dramatic in fighting vessels than in supporting craft, and the commanders on that side had compensated for their numerical shortfall through a doctrinal emphasis on manoeuvre and positioning. Where the First Fleet trained principally for the exchange of broadside fire, the Second had incorporated a more flexible tactical philosophy, one that placed a premium on disrupting an opponent's formation before the main engagement, rather than relying on the momentum of the collision itself. Whether this doctrinal difference had been fully absorbed by the captains and crews who would need to execute it is a different question, and one worth holding on to as the battle develops. The crews deserve attention beyond simple numbers. The First Fleet carried men drawn from a broader recruitment pool, which meant more bodies on deck but also a wider variance in quality. The Second Fleet's crews were smaller in aggregate, but had served together longer on average, which in a naval engagement of this period was a meaningful advantage. Cohesion under fire, familiarity with a particular ship's handling characteristics, and the kind of practice communication between officers and petty officers that does not come from drilling alone. All of this favoured the side whose men had been together longer. Training frequency differed too. The Second Fleet had conducted more recent exercises, including gunnery practice, that the First had not matched in the months preceding the encounter. Whether those advantages would hold once the smoke and noise of actual combat replaced the controlled conditions of exercises was, of course, unknowable in advance. There were technological differences as well, though these were not dramatic by the standards of the wider period. Both fleets operated within a broadly similar technological moment. The question was less about what weapons each side carried, and more about how reliably those weapons could be served under pressure, how quickly damaged rigging could be addressed, and how effectively commanders could maintain situational awareness once visibility degraded, as it always did in these engagements. Contemporary observers, and there were some who followed events closely enough to form opinions before the battle began, tended to favour the larger fleet. Numbers tend to reassure those who observe from a distance. The political and commercial interests allied with the first power spoke confidently about the outcome. The second power's supporters were more cautious in public, while privately arguing that the difference in capability was less significant than it appeared on paper, a position that is easier to defend in advance than after the fact if things go badly. Both sides had reasons to be confident. Both sides had reasons to worry. That combination, competing justifications for optimism coexisting with genuine uncertainty, is actually the normal condition before a major battle, and it is worth keeping in mind. The engagement that was about to unfold was not predetermined. It was genuinely contested, and the factors that would tip it one way or the other were still, at this point, unresolved, which means the road to collision still had its final miles to travel. That road, it turns out, was longer and stranger than either side had anticipated. The fleets did not simply find each other. They were pushed toward each other by a sequence of decisions, failures and miscalculations that stretched across weeks, and in some respects months, a chain of events where almost every link was an opportunity to stop what was coming, and almost none of those opportunities were taken. It is worth understanding that open naval combat was not, at the outset, what either government was explicitly seeking. The rhetoric on both sides was aggressive enough, but rhetoric and operational orders are different documents, and the orders being issued in the weeks before the engagement were noticeably hedged. One side wanted leverage. The presence of its fleet in contested waters was meant to force a political concession without requiring an actual fight. The other side wanted to deny that leverage without provoking a confrontation. It was not certain it could win decisively. Both positions were, in theory, compatible with avoiding battle. In practice, they created the conditions for one. The diplomatic track had been running parallel to the military build-up for some time, and the honest account of it is not flattering to either party. Negotiations had stalled, not because of any single dramatic breakdown, but because of something more mundane and more damaging, a persistent unwillingness on both sides to offer anything the other could actually accept. Proposals were exchanged, but they were drafted more as records of good faith for later use than as genuine attempts to resolve the underlying dispute. Envoys sent to mediate found themselves received politely and then quietly sidelined. The moment when a negotiated settlement was genuinely within reach, and historians who have studied the surviving correspondence believe there was such a moment, passed without either side recognizing it clearly enough to act. Into this diplomatic vacuum, provocations began to accumulate. A merchant vessel detained under disputed circumstances, a coastal patrol that crossed an invisible boundary with debatable intent, intelligence reports, some accurate and some wildly wrong, circulated among commanders on both sides and shaped expectations in ways that made caution harder to justify. One set of reports, which later turned out to be significantly overstated, suggested the opposing fleet was closer to full operational readiness than it actually was, creating an urgency in the planning process that accelerated decisions that might otherwise have been deferred. The pressure of bad information flowing upward into command structures is a recurring feature of pre-battle histories, and this one was no exception. Strategic gambits began to replace diplomatic options. One side made a calculated move to occupy a position it had not previously held, partly to strengthen its negotiating posture, partly to respond to domestic political pressure that demanded something visible, something that could be pointed to as action. The move was not intended as a provocation in the technical sense. It was intended as a signal, but signals have a way of being received differently than they are sent, and the response on the other side was to read the occupation not as a negotiating gesture, but as evidence that negotiation had effectively been abandoned. This is the kind of misreading that changes the sequence of events without anyone having made a decision to go to war. Logistical pressures were now beginning to narrow the choices available to both commanders. Neither fleet could remain indefinitely at its current level of readiness without either fighting or retreating. Supply chains that had seemed adequate at the start of the standoff were showing strain. Water, provisions, the maintenance demands of ships held at action stations for extended periods, all of these created a ticking clock that operated independently of any political or diplomatic timeline. The commander who faced the greater logistical constraint was the one who had less flexibility about when to force the issue. That constraint was not fully understood by the opposing side, which might have used the information to wait, to be patient, to let time do what combat would eventually do at greater cost. But they did not have that information, and the opportunity passed with everything else. Then came the intelligence report that changed the operational picture entirely. A scouting vessel, or possibly more than one, the accounts differ, brought back information indicating the enemy fleet had repositioned. The repositioning was real, though its purpose was apparently routine rather than aggressive. But the effect of the report was to create the impression of imminent action, of a window that was closing, of a moment that demanded response. The commander who received it had been operating under instructions that were already pushing him toward engagement. The report gave him what he needed to make the final commitment. Orders went out. The fleet moved, and here is where the element of miscalculation reached its most consequential expression. The movement was intended to achieve a favourable positioning before battle, not to initiate battle immediately. The expectation on that side was that there would still be time to manoeuvre, time perhaps even for a final exchange of messages that might resolve the standoff at the last moment. That expectation was wrong. The distances involved, the speed at which both fleets were now moving, and the geographical constraints of the waters they were operating in combined to produce contact sooner and under different conditions than either commander had planned for. The other fleet was not seeking battle at that precise moment either. Its commander had his own plan, his own preferred positioning, his own sense of the timing that would give him the best chance if fighting became unavoidable. He did not get it. What he got instead was the news that the opposing fleet had been sighted, that it was closer than expected, and that the options he had been holding in reserve were no longer available. Both sides had wanted, to varying degrees, to control the terms of any engagement. Neither succeeded. The battle that followed was not the battle either commander had designed. It was the battle that the accumulated failures of diplomacy, the pressure of miscommunication, the distortions of bad intelligence, and the hard logic of logistics had made almost inevitable, though almost in history as in life, is never quite the same as completely. The ships that had been watching each other from a cautious distance were now on converging courses. The window for changing course was closing fast, and the first moves were already being made. The sighting came earlier than either commander had wanted, and in conditions that neither had chosen. Visibility was imperfect. Accounts from the period describe a combination of haze, the particular glare that settles over open water in certain seasons and latitudes, and the interference of smoke from vessels that had been running hard to achieve position. What each fleet could see of the other was incomplete, and the decisions made in the opening phase of the engagement were decisions made with partial information about an adversary who was simultaneously making decisions with equally partial information. That shared uncertainty shaped everything that followed. The first formal move was a question of formation, and both commanders had strong views on the subject. Naval doctrine of the era placed enormous weight on the line, the capacity to bring the maximum number of guns to bear, in an organized sequence, while minimizing exposure. The commander who held the wind gauge, who could dictate the angle and timing of approach, had a significant advantage, and both sides understood this well enough, that the early manoeuvring was less about closing the distance than about denying the other that advantage. Ships moved not toward each other but around each other, jockeying for position in ways that consumed time and revealed intention without resolving anything. To an observer at a distance it might have looked almost choreographed. To the men aboard those ships, reading flags and watching the horizon, and trying to understand what the movements they were seeing actually meant, it was anything but. Signalling introduced its own complications. The flag systems in use were capable of transmitting clearly defined instructions under ideal conditions. Conditions were not ideal. Distance, the angle of the light, and the behaviour of the wind all affected whether signals could be read accurately, whether they could be read at all, and whether what was received matched what had been sent. There is evidence in at least some of the surviving accounts that instructions issued by one of the fleet commanders during this opening phase were interpreted differently by different captains receiving them, that the fleet did not move as a unified body, but instead moved as a collection of individual ships, each acting on its own understanding of what had been ordered. This is not unusual in naval history, but it matters here because the tactical plan depended on coordination, and the coordination began to fray almost immediately. The wind shifted. It may seem like a minor thing to place alongside questions of strategy and command, but in the context of sailing warships, it was not minor at all. A wind shift could nullify a positional advantage that had taken hours to achieve. It could expose a formation that had been carefully arranged to protect its most vulnerable angles. It could also, in some cases, present an unexpected opportunity, a sudden opening in an adversary's line, a favourable approach that had not previously existed. The question was always whether the shift was recognised in time to be exploited, and whether the fleet's organisation was flexible enough to act on it. Here, the evidence suggests that the shift created problems for one side more than the other, forcing a recalculation of the approach and introducing a delay that had downstream consequences for the shape of the battle. Current was a secondary factor, but not an irrelevant one. These particular waters had tidal behaviour that experienced local pilots understood, and that fleet commanders operating from charts and reports rather than personal familiarity understood less precisely. There were moments in the early phase where ships found themselves making less headway than anticipated, or being carried along courses they had not exactly chosen, and where the cumulative effect was to push the two forces toward contact at an angle and a moment that neither had specifically intended. Then something happened that cut through all of the manoeuvring and transformed the encounter. The first shot, and its origins are genuinely disputed, which is itself a detail worth holding on to, was fired in circumstances that neither fleet had yet formally acknowledged as a battle. The range was long, the effect uncertain, but the sound carried. Every ship in both fleets heard it, and whatever ambiguity had persisted about whether this encounter might somehow resolve without full engagement dissolved in that moment. Commanders who had been holding options in reserve now closed those options. Captains who had been waiting for clarity about their orders now operated on the assumption that fighting had begun. This was the first turning point, and it revealed something important. What had been conceived as a controlled approach to a negotiated or at least managed confrontation had become something ungoverned. The opening shot, wherever it came from, and whatever its precise intention, had transferred the decision from the commanders to the event itself. The battle would now determine its own terms. What had each side actually intended in this opening phase? The best reconstruction suggests that one commander had hoped to force a defensive position on the other, to achieve a disposition of his fleet that would compel the adversary to either withdraw or attack on unfavourable terms. It was a plan that required time and space, and a degree of passivity from the opposing force that the opposing force did not provide. The other commander had intended something more aggressive in theory, but was operating under constraints of formation and supply that made aggression difficult to execute cleanly. He wanted a concentrated attack on a specific segment of the opposing line. What he got was a dispersed engagement in which concentration was exactly what he could not achieve. The gap between intention and reality is a permanent feature of battle, acknowledged by every serious military thinker and consistently underestimated by every military planner. But the gap in this opening phase was unusually wide, and the reason for that width is not hard to identify. Both commanders had planned for an engagement that began on terms they controlled. Neither had adequately planned for an engagement that began in confusion, under degraded visibility, with uncertain communications and a wind that refused to cooperate. The opening moves at sea were supposed to be the phase where each side established the conditions for success. Instead, they became the phase where the conditions for catastrophe were quietly assembled, piece by piece before anyone fully recognized what was happening. By the time both fleets had committed, when the distances had closed and the gun decks were being cleared, and the men at the rails could see the opposing ships clearly for the first time. The battle was already different from the battle anyone had planned to fight, and it was about to become something else again. The moment both fleets fully committed to close action, the abstract geometry of naval manoeuvring gave way to something far more elemental. Distances that had been measured in miles were now measured in yards, and at those ranges the guns were not firing for position or signalling intent, they were firing to destroy. What had been choreography became carnage with very little warning in between. The escalation was not instantaneous, but it was fast, and it followed a pattern recognizable in naval engagements of the period. The opening broadsides, delivered as the leading ships of each fleet crossed into effective range, established a tempo that neither side could easily abandon. Once a crew had fired and was reloading, once the smoke had begun to obscure the deck, and the noise had made verbal communication nearly impossible, the tactical situation could really only move in one direction, closing more fire, sustained engagement at ranges that eliminated any remaining margin for manoeuvre. The ships that had been jockeying so carefully for position were now locked into something that position alone could not resolve. The first significant exchanges fell hardest on the lead vessels. This was almost inevitable. The ships at the van of each line bore the concentrated fire of an adversary who had not yet engaged the full length of the opposing fleet, and the damage accumulated quickly. Rigging went first in most accounts, the upper works taking hits that reduced manoeuvrability and complicated any attempt to maintain formation. Then hulls, then the guns themselves. A battery silenced on one side of an engagement means more than the loss of those particular weapons. It means a gap in the rhythm of fire that the opposing crew can feel, a momentary sense of breathing room that changes the confidence on both gun decks simultaneously. Command decisions in this phase were under extraordinary pressure. A fleet commander in the era of sail fought an engagement he could observe only partially, communicated through signals that smoke and chaos were rendering unreliable, and depended on subordinate captains to exercise judgment in ways that might or might not align with his broader intentions. What the surviving accounts suggest about this particular battle is that at least one of those captains made a choice, possibly independently, that had consequences far beyond his own ship. Whether the choice was a deviation from orders or a reasonable interpretation of them in circumstances orders had not anticipated, is one of those questions the available evidence refuses to settle cleanly. What is clear is that a movement occurred at a critical moment that was not replicated by neighbouring vessels, and the effect was to create an opening that the opposing fleet was positioned to exploit and did. This is the hinge point that students of the battle return to repeatedly, because it is where one side appeared, briefly, to gain a meaningful edge. A concentrated group of vessels found themselves with a line of approach that bypassed the most heavily defended segment of the opposing fleet. It was exactly the kind of concentrated attack that one commander had wanted but been unable to achieve in the opening phase. Now, almost by accident, the geometry had reassembled itself in his favour. The question was whether he recognized it fast enough, and whether his fleet was still cohesive enough to exploit it. The answer, frustratingly, seems to have been almost. There is evidence of a push, a genuine attempt to drive through the opening before it closed. There is also evidence that the attempt was not fully coordinated, that ships which should have supported the thrust were delayed, or had sustained damage that reduced their speed, or had received signals that directed them elsewhere. The opportunity narrowed and then closed without being fully realized. It is one of the battle's defining might-have-beens, and it deserves weight not because one side deserved to win, but because the failure to capitalize illuminates something real about the limits of tactical flexibility under combat conditions. Meanwhile, the human cost was accumulating on both sides in ways that affected not just the numbers, but the capacity to continue fighting effectively. Damage control aboard a wooden warship under fire was its own form of skilled combat, crews fighting flooding, containing fires, splicing lines under conditions that tested training and composure in equal measure. What distinguished the ships that continued to fight effectively from those that didn't was rarely the scale of the damage alone. It was the response to the damage. And here, accounts from the period suggest meaningful differences between the two fleets. One side's discipline held with relative consistency even as losses mounted. The other showed signs of strain, not collapse, not yet, but a raggedness in the execution that suggested crews were approaching limits. Morale in naval combat is inseparable from the information available to the men on the gun decks. A crew that believes it is winning fights differently from one that suspects it is losing, and the signals available, the behaviour of nearby ships, the volume of incoming fire, the condition of their own vessel, were not always accurate guides to the broader picture. There were moments in this battle where individual ships were fighting with tremendous effectiveness, while the fleet as a whole was deteriorating, and moments where the reverse was also true. The gap between the tactical experience of a single crew and the operational reality across the fleet was enormous, and it contributed to decisions being made at both levels that would look different in retrospect. The most consequential ship losses of this middle phase came in ways that were not necessarily the most dramatic. A vessel driven out of line and unable to return, even if not sunk, degraded the coherence of the formation around it. A ship whose captain was killed or incapacitated introduced a crisis of local command at the precise moment when decisive action might have mattered most. It is in the accumulation of these smaller catastrophes, the line gaps, the silenced batteries, the commanders gone at critical instants, that the larger outcome was being quietly determined, even as the surface of the battle still looked like an unresolved and roughly equal contest. By the time the fighting had been sustained for several hours, the engagement had moved well beyond what either fleet had designed for. The careful plans were gone. What remained was something rawer and more unpredictable. Exhausted men, damaged ships, commanders working with partial information and diminishing options. The discipline of the opening had given way to the brutal improvisation of a battle that had found its own momentum. And the worst was not yet over. What came next was not a clean culmination. It was a disintegration, a formation of certainty, of the kind of controlled violence that naval commanders preferred to inflict and dreaded receiving. The brutal improvisation that had characterized the middle hours of the fighting now accelerated into something harder to describe and harder still to reconstruct, because the witnesses who survived it remembered different battles depending on which deck they had stood on. Orderly command, already strained, broke down in stages rather than all at once. Flag signals became meaningless, not because they stopped being sent, but because the smoke and the loss of masts made them impossible to read reliably from more than a ship's length away. Captains who might have looked to their fleet commander for direction were now fighting, of necessity, by instinct and personal judgment. In some cases that produced remarkable results. In others it produced exactly the kind of uncoordinated effort that turns a hard fight into a lost one. It is in this phase that individual acts become conspicuous, and the historical record, however fragmentary, preserves a few with some consistency. There was at least one captain, accounts disagree on which side, who took his damaged vessel directly into a gap that opened in the opposing line, a move that by any conventional calculation was closer to suicide than strategy. He pressed the attack at close range, with guns that were already partially silenced, against a ship that should have had every advantage. Whether this was desperation, genuine tactical insight, or simply the kind of decision that gets made when a man has run out of better options, the result was to create confusion at a critical point in the opposing formation. It forced a response that pulled vessels out of position. It may have bought time for a withdrawal that would otherwise have been far more costly. Or it may have been precisely the kind of gesture that looks meaningful in hindsight, but changed very little. The sources are not unanimous, and that ambiguity is itself worth sitting with. Because here is the uncomfortable truth about assigning credit or blame for what happened next. The collapse, when it finally became undeniable, did not have a single clear cause. Strategy had a role. One commander had consistently made better use of concentration and had kept his fleet more coherent through the opening and middle phases. But luck had a role too. There is credible evidence that weather conditions shifted during the later hours of the engagement, a wind change that disadvantaged one fleet's ability to maintain its chosen angle of attack and favoured the other's line of withdrawal. Whether this was decisive or merely convenient to the losing side's later explanations is precisely the kind of question that historians argue about, because both things can be simultaneously true. What seems harder to dispute is the cumulative weight of mistakes. Not catastrophic errors, not moments of obvious incompetence, but the steady accumulation of small miscalculations, a formation that closed too slowly when it should have pressed, a reserve that was committed too late or in the wrong direction, a signal that was misread and resulted in ships moving away from where they were most needed. Each of these alone might have been recovered from. Together, they bent the trajectory of the battle in one direction and eventually snapped it. The moment when defeat became undeniable is described differently in virtually every account that has survived. One version places the turning point at the loss of a specific vessel that had served as an anchor for one fleet's centre formation. Once it was driven from the line, the coherence of the whole unravelled within the hour. Another account dismisses this as a rationalization applied after the fact, arguing instead that the decision to withdraw had already been effectively made before that loss occurred, and that the loss was a consequence of the withdrawal's disorder rather than its cause. A third perspective, drawn from correspondence rather than battle reports, suggests the commander on the losing side had recognized as early as mid-engagement that the tactical situation had turned against him, but delayed the decision to disengage out of something that might have been pride, or a genuine belief that one more push might reverse the momentum. All three versions contain elements that are plausible. None of them is complete. This is the nature of evidence from engagements like this one, shaped by who was in a position to observe, filtered through the understandable desire to explain failure in terms that minimize individual responsibility, and sometimes contradicted by documents that emerged only long after the principal participants were dead. What is clear is that when the withdrawal finally came, it was not clean. Disengaging from a close-action engagement at sea required a level of coordination that a damaged and partially dispersed fleet could not fully achieve. Some ships broke away successfully and made distance before the opposing fleet could reorganize to pursue. Others were caught in transition, not yet committed to withdrawal, but no longer able to sustain effective resistance. And those ships suffered disproportionately in the final phase of the action. A rearguard of some kind, whether formally ordered or informally assumed by captains who recognized the situation, took significant punishment, while the bulk of the fleet attempted to open the range. The courage here was real, whatever one concludes about the strategy. Men who had been fighting for hours, on ships that were barely answering to their helms, continued to serve guns and manage damage with a professionalism that the chaotic circumstances did not erase. The battle's losing side, in this final phase, did not dissolve into panic. It deteriorated under pressure, slowly and with resistance, which is a different thing. That distinction matters, not just for accuracy, but because it complicates any simple narrative of one fleet triumphing decisively over another. What the winners had achieved, by the time the smoke began to thin and the distance between the fleets had grown enough to make further action impractical, was less a crushing victory than a compelling one, a result that was real, consequential, and costly, but that left room for the losing side to dispute its magnitude for years afterward. And dispute it they did, which is part of why this battle remained contested in the historical record long after it stopped being fought on the water. When the guns fell silent and the last ships found enough sea room to stop fighting, what remained was a picture that neither side could fully claim. The battle had ended, but what it meant, in terms of ships lost, men dead, and strategic consequence, was already becoming a contested question, and the contestation began not in the years that followed, but in the days. The immediate material accounting was grim on both sides, though distributed unequally. The losing fleet had surrendered or lost outright several vessels. The precise number varies depending on which set of records you consult, and the records themselves were compiled under conditions that did not encourage precision. Damaged ships misidentified as sunk, prizes recaptured before they could be brought to port, casualties undercounted in official dispatches because the full toll had not yet been determined when commanders filed their initial reports. The winning fleet had its own damage to absorb. Victory at sea in this era was rarely clean, and the surviving ships of the prevailing force limped into port with shot-riddled hulls, reduced rigging, and crew numbers well below what they had been when they sailed out. Some vessels were assessed as beyond economical repair. Others would take months to return to any kind of operational readiness. The coastal defences that the battle had been fought, in part to test or to protect, were now exposed in their limitations. Whatever confidence had existed before the engagement about the security of this stretch of water had been replaced by something considerably more anxious. For the side that had lost, the implications were immediate and obvious. The enemy had demonstrated a capacity to operate with relative freedom in waters that had not been considered freely available to them. Ports that had felt reasonably secure were now within reach of a fleet that had proven it could fight its way through. For the winning side, the revelation was different but equally uncomfortable. The victory had cost more than expected, and the resources needed to exploit what had been won were not fully available. The door had been opened, but walking through it was going to take time. What happened in the public record in the weeks that followed is where the story starts to get genuinely interesting, because the gap between what the dispatches said and what had actually happened at sea was not small. The victorious commanders sent reports home that were, in the language of the time, favourable, meaning they emphasised what had been achieved and treated the costs as regrettable but secondary. They had driven off the enemy, they had taken prizes. They had secured, at least temporarily, a meaningful operational advantage. These claims were not false exactly, but they were framed in ways that made a costly and complicated engagement read like something considerably more decisive. The political need for good news shaped the language, and the language shaped what the public understood to have occurred. The losing side did something equally revealing. Their official accounts were not confessions. They were reconstructions that acknowledged setbacks while arguing, with some energy, that the outcome had been more equitable than the enemy's version suggested. Terms like tactical withdrawal and disputed engagement entered the correspondence and the early published accounts. The argument was not that they had won, that would have been too implausible, but that they had not lost as thoroughly as the other side was claiming, that the circumstances had been unfavourable in ways that did not reflect the true balance of capabilities, and that the situation remained recoverable. This was partly self-serving, but it was also partly true, and the inability to cleanly separate the honest assessment from the damage control is part of what makes the historical record so difficult to work with. Among the surviving crews, the experience of the aftermath was defined by exhaustion, injury, and the slow bureaucratic process of accounting for the dead. Letters written by sailors and junior officers in the days following the battle, the ones that have survived, which are far fewer than historians would like, describe a dazed quality to the immediate period. The scale of what had happened had not yet resolved into meaning. Men had fought and died, and the ships had come back, some of them, and now there was the work of repairing what could be repaired and burying or recording what could not. The emotional texture of the aftermath was complex, and rarely made it into official documentation, which preferred the cleaner grammar of tonnage and casualties and operational assessments. What the battle had opened in strategic terms was a window. Not a guarantee, not a permanent shift, but a genuine opportunity for the winning side and a genuine vulnerability for the losing one. Whether that window would be exploited depended on decisions that had not yet been made, resources that had not yet been allocated, and political will that was not yet certain. In the short term, the side that had lost found itself adjusting its dispositions, pulling forces back from positions that now looked exposed, reconsidering assumptions that had seemed stable before the engagement. The side that had won found itself in the unfamiliar position of having to decide what to do with an advantage that was real but temporary, in waters that remained dangerous, with ships that needed attention before they could be pushed hard again. And underneath all of this, beneath the dispatches and the damage assessments and the strategic recalculations, something else was already beginning. The narrative war had started. The first accounts to reach wider circulation were not neutral descriptions but arguments shaped by the need to explain what had happened in terms that served someone's interest. Commanders who had performed poorly needed protecting. Decisions that had contributed to the outcome needed to be attributed or diffused. The political consequences of defeat in a major engagement were serious enough that there was genuine incentive to manage the story, and the story was being managed before the ships were even fully repaired. This is worth marking as a moment, because what happened to the memory of this battle in the years and decades that followed was not simply a product of neglect or the natural erosion of historical attention. It was seeded in these early weeks when the people closest to the event were already constructing versions of it that served purposes other than accuracy. The erasure, if that is the right word, did not come later. It began almost immediately, and understanding that changes what we need to look for when we ask why this battle fell out of the histories, because the question isn't just what got forgotten, but what was quietly being buried while the guns were still warm. So the dispatches were already being shaped, the narrative war already underway. But underneath all of that management of appearances, there's a harder question that deserves a direct answer. Did this battle actually change anything? Not in the stories people told about it, but in the world itself, in the shipping lanes and the invasion plans, and the balance of power at sea. That's the question that cuts through the drama and asks for something more uncomfortable, a clear-eyed look at consequence. The temptation with any naval engagement is to judge it by its intensity. Dramatic battles feel important. The visual logic of burning ships and decisive charges suggests that something fundamental must have shifted when all of that violence was expended. But military historians have learned, often painfully, that the correlation between battlefield drama and strategic consequence is weaker than it looks. Some of the most spectacular engagements in naval history produce surprisingly little change in the underlying situation, and some quieter, less celebrated actions turned out to be pivotal in ways that only became visible years later. So where does this battle sit on that spectrum? In the short term, the effects were real and measurable, even if they were not as clean as the victorious side's dispatches implied. The losing fleet's ability to project power into the contested stretch of water was meaningfully degraded, not eliminated, that would be too strong, but reduced in a way that created genuine operational breathing room for the winning side. Invasion plans that had been moving through the planning stages with some confidence now encountered friction. The assumptions underpinning those plans about the availability of naval cover, about the security of supply lines, about the vulnerability of the opposing coast, had been tested and found to be less reliable than believed. That matters. Planning doesn't happen in a vacuum, and when the conditions that planning depends on shift, the plans shift with them or collapse. Commerce was affected in ways that the formal strategic record tends to undercount. The waters around the battle site were, for a period afterward, less freely navigable for the losing side's merchant traffic. Insurance rates moved, sailing schedules changed. Convoys that had operated with a certain confidence became more cautious, and that caution had economic costs that accumulated quietly over months. None of this shows up in the battle's immediate aftermath as a dramatic consequence, but it was a consequence nonetheless, the kind that works through systems rather than through announcements. The regional security picture shifted in subtler ways. Ports and coastal communities that had sat under one kind of threat before the battle found themselves recalculating their exposure afterward. Alliances that had been stable started to show stress as the implications of the outcome worked their way through diplomatic correspondence. The battle did not end any of the underlying rivalries. Those ran too deep to be resolved by a single engagement. but it redistributed leverage in ways that took time to become fully visible. Here's where the comparison between short-term and long-term significance becomes genuinely complicated, because later events intervened, as they always do. Larger conflicts arrived. New fleets were built, commanders who had fought here died or were replaced. The specific operational situation that the battle had transformed was itself transformed again by subsequent developments, and each transformation made it harder to isolate what this particular engagement had contributed. The battle's effects were real, but they were absorbed into a moving situation, which meant they became increasingly difficult to trace. This is not the same as saying the effects weren't there. It's saying that later events, either diluted or, in some readings, actually magnified what the battle had set in motion, depending on which thread of consequence you choose to follow. There's a serious argument that the battle's most significant legacy was indirect. Not what it changed immediately, but what it prevented or enabled in ways that only became clear in retrospect. The invasion plans that stalled in the aftermath, did they stall permanently because of this battle, or did they stall for other reasons, and this was merely one factor among several? The naval dominance that the winning side appeared to consolidate, was it genuinely consolidated by this engagement, or would it have developed anyway through the accumulation of other advantages? These are questions that historians can probe but cannot answer with finality, because the counterfactual, the world in which this battle did not happen, is not available for inspection. What is available is a pattern that recurs in the study of overlooked engagements. Indirect legacy is often more durable than direct legacy. The battles that change things immediately and dramatically tend to be remembered precisely because the change is legible. The battles that change things indirectly, through the pressure they apply to planning and confidence and resource allocation, tend to fade from view because the connection between cause and effect is harder to draw. The impact is real, it's just diffuse, and diffuse impacts don't generate the kind of clear narrative that histories are built around. This particular battle appears to fall into that second category. Its strategic consequences were genuine, but not overwhelming. It shifted the balance without overturning it. It created opportunities that were only partially exploited. It weakened plans without destroying them, and the subsequent flow of events, the larger conflicts, the more celebrated engagements, the figures who commanded more historical attention, layered over those consequences in ways that made them progressively harder to see. None of that makes the battle unimportant. It makes it important in the way that a lot of real history is important, not through clean decisive moments, but through the accumulation of pressures and adjustments and recalculations that don't photograph well and don't generate memorable quotes, but nonetheless shape outcomes. The world that came after this battle was different from the world that would have existed without it, probably. The margin of difference may not have been enormous, but in the tight calculations of naval power and regional security, margins matter. And there's something worth sitting with here. The battles we do remember are not always the ones that mattered most. They're often the ones that mattered most visibly. This battle mattered in ways that required more attention to see, which may be precisely why it became so easy to overlook, and why understanding how it was forgotten requires us to look not just at the history, but at the machinery that decides which history gets told. That machinery, the mechanism that decides which history gets told, doesn't operate by accident. It has architects, it has tools, and for most of recorded history, the most powerful architects of historical memory have not been scholars or archivists. They've been governments. This is worth understanding clearly because it's easy to imagine historical forgetting as a passive process. A battle recedes from memory because attention moves elsewhere, because no one thought to write it down carefully enough, because the participants died before they could leave adequate records. That kind of forgetting exists, and we'll examine it more closely in a moment. But there's another kind of forgetting, one that is considerably less passive, considerably more purposeful, and it tends to produce silences that are too consistent, too convenient, and too perfectly shaped around political need to have arrived there by coincidence. States have always managed historical narrative. This is not a cynical observation, it's simply a description of how political power operates across cultures and centuries. A ruling dynasty, a military establishment, a colonial administration, a revolutionary government. Each of them has a stake in the story that gets told about the past, because that story shapes legitimacy in the present. The battle that revealed a commander's incompetence becomes a battle that demonstrated heroic sacrifice against impossible odds. The defeat that exposed the fragility of a naval strategy becomes a tactical setback on the way to ultimate triumph. The engagement that cost more than it achieved becomes, in official memory, a necessary price paid for larger goals. The transformation is rarely total. Too obvious a lie invites disbelief, but it is systematic, and its mechanisms are specific. Censorship is the bluntest of those mechanisms. Records get sealed. Dispatches get redacted before they enter official archives. Survivors are discouraged, formally or informally, from speaking at length about what they witnessed. Naval engagements are particularly susceptible to this kind of management because the primary witnesses, the men aboard the ships, were often lower ranking, often without writing skills or social standing, and often facing institutional pressure to conform to the official account. The officers who might have left detailed memoirs had careers to protect. The ordinary sailors who experienced the chaos directly left far fewer traces in the documentary record, and the traces they did leave were easier to marginalize or ignore. Selective reporting operates differently, but achieves similar results. Here the information is not suppressed so much as it is filtered through the same outlets, in the same format, with the same emphasis, until a particular version of events achieves the density of repetition that makes it feel like established fact. Official histories commission the narratives. Government-aligned newspapers carry the authorized account. Commemorative ceremonies reinforce the preferred interpretation year after year until the alternative readings which do exist, which are accessible to anyone willing to look, feel like revisionism rather than recovery. The original distortion becomes the baseline, and correcting it requires arguing against a weight of repeated assertion that can feel almost geological. Archive control is perhaps the most lasting of these tools. Who controls the documents controls the history, not absolutely, but substantially. When a government holds the primary sources, it determines what is catalogued and what is not, what is accessible to researchers and what remains restricted, what is preserved with care and what is allowed to deteriorate or disappear. The gaps in archives are not always accidental. Sometimes a gap is a policy. Sometimes the absence of a particular category of document, reports from the losing side of a specific engagement, casualty counts that contradict official figures, correspondence that reveals the political calculations behind a military decision, is more eloquent than anything the surviving documents contain. All of this connects directly to the question of national myth. Every nation-state generates founding or sustaining narratives about itself. Stories of destiny, resilience, martial virtue, providential survival, and those narratives require the historical record to cooperate. The problem is that the historical record doesn't always cooperate naturally. A battle that doesn't fit the myth has to be managed. If the official national story depends on the idea of naval supremacy, then a significant defeat at sea is awkward, not just embarrassing, but structurally inconvenient. It undermines the premise. And so the defeat gets minimized, reframed, buried under qualifications, or simply omitted from the narratives that circulate most widely. The myth is preserved. The evidence that complicates it is allowed to grow quiet. This is worth applying directly to the battle we've been examining. Whether the outcome was a defeat, a costly and inconclusive engagement, or an inconvenient victory, meaning a win that revealed vulnerabilities or raised uncomfortable questions about strategy and command, the logic of official management would have operated similarly. A costly victory might generate almost as much institutional discomfort as a defeat, if the cost exposed decisions that powerful individuals needed to protect. Commanders who survived and went on to hold positions of influence had every incentive to ensure that the historical record did not dwell on their most difficult moments. And the governments they served had parallel incentives to ensure that the narrative of their naval programs remained as flattering as possible. The downstream effect on textbooks and popular education is where all of this crystallizes into the everyday reality of what people know and don't know. Textbooks don't draw on the full range of archival material. They draw on synthesized histories, official accounts, and the established consensus of educated opinion, and if that consensus was shaped by decades of selective emphasis, the textbook inherits the distortion without necessarily being aware of it. Teachers teach what was taught to them. The omission becomes self-perpetuating, because each generation's understanding of the past is built on the previous generation's already filtered version of events. To restore something to the textbook requires overcoming not just the original suppression, but all the subsequent reinforcement of that suppression through every educational cycle since. There's a subtler version of this problem too. Sometimes the shaping of historical memory doesn't require active conspiracy. It requires only that the people who make decisions about what to include and what to exclude share a set of assumptions about what matters, and that those assumptions happen to align with the political interests of the powerful. No one needs to issue explicit orders to downplay a battle that doesn't fit the preferred narrative. The narrative preference operates at the level of instinct and convention, shaping choices that feel like professional judgment rather than political compliance. Understanding that machinery is not an exercise in cynicism. It's a prerequisite for understanding why the evidence for this battle required such determined recovery, and why the historians who tried to recover it found themselves working against more than just the passage of time. So if governments shape what gets remembered, the next question is what historians actually find when they go looking, and the answer is often far messier than any deliberate suppression could explain on its own. Reconstructing a naval battle from the distant past is not like reconstructing a land engagement where armies cross terrain that still exists, where siege works can be excavated, where the ground itself sometimes yields evidence. A battle fought at sea leaves the ocean unchanged. The ships, if they sank, rest below the water. The men who died there took their recollections with them in the most absolute sense possible. What remains are documents, and documents, as any working historian will tell you, have a way of being incomplete in exactly the wrong places. The core sources for a battle like this would typically include official dispatches sent from commanders to their superiors in the immediate aftermath, ships' logs maintained throughout the engagement, eyewitness accounts gathered for courts of inquiry or official investigations, correspondence between officers and their governments, and, where they survive, the private letters and journals of men who served aboard the ships and lived to write about it. In an ideal case, you'd have substantial material from both sides of the engagement, allowing historians to cross-reference competing claims and build a picture that is triangulated rather than one-sided. In practice, the source base for this particular battle is riddled with problems at almost every level. Start with the dispatches. These were written under pressure, often within hours of the engagement ending, by commanders who had strong personal and institutional reasons to present their actions in the most favourable possible light. A commander who lost ships he wasn't supposed to lose, who made tactical decisions that can be questioned in retrospect, who found himself outmanoeuvred at a critical moment. That commander does not write a dispatch that says so plainly. He describes the engagement in language that emphasizes the enemy's strength, his own men's courage, and the extraordinary circumstances that prevented a complete victory. This is not unique to any particular navy or era. It is a nearly universal feature of official military reporting, and it means that the dispatches historians most rely on are also the documents most systematically shaped to obscure what actually happened. Then there are the logs. Ships' logs were kept with varying levels of care and completeness, and for this battle, the survival rate is uneven. Some logs appear never to have made it into any archive, either lost in the chaos of the engagement itself, destroyed by fire or water, or simply never systematically preserved. Others survive but contain entries that are conspicuously sparse for the period covering the battle. raising the reasonable suspicion that what was recorded may have been transcribed or edited after the fact rather than written in real time. The gaps are not proof of tampering, but they are invitations to doubt, and doubt is not the same as evidence. For any battle involving powers whose primary languages differ from those of the scholars who later study it, translation compounds every other problem. Reports written in one language get translated into another, and in that process, specialized nautical terminology shifts, meaning numerical claims become ambiguous, and the rhetorical conventions of one military culture get flattened into the conventions of another. A phrase that indicated a tactical retreat in its original context might read as a rout in translation, or vice versa. Dates can become confused when different calendar systems are in use simultaneously, a real complication for engagements involving powers from different parts of the world in certain periods. By the time a document has passed through multiple languages and multiple scholarly hands, it carries an invisible layer of interpretive residue that is almost impossible to fully strip away. And then there's the question of whose voices dominate the surviving record. Chronicles and histories written close in time to the battle were invariably produced by people with partisan interests. A chronicler serving the court of one of the involved powers was not writing neutral history. He was writing history in service of a patron, and his patron had preferences about how the engagement should appear. Historians have long known how to read against the grain of such sources, but reading against the grain requires having enough of the grain to push against. When only one tradition of chronicle writing survives, or when the sources from one side of the engagement are vastly more numerous than those from the other, the historian's ability to triangulate collapses. The dominant source tradition doesn't just offer a partial view, it fills the available space and makes its partiality invisible. All of this, the silences, the contradictions, the translation problems, the partisan chroniclers, has a direct effect on what ends up in the broad surveys of history that most people ever encounter. A naval historian willing to spend years working through fragmentary evidence can produce a credible reconstruction of an understudied battle. But the authors of comprehensive surveys, the scholars writing textbooks or general histories of an era, are making hundreds of decisions about what to include and what to set aside. When the evidence for a particular battle is thin, contradictory, or technically demanding to interpret, the calculation tilts toward omission. It's not dishonesty, it's the practical reality of writing history at scale. A battle you can describe with confidence earns its paragraph. A battle that would require 3 pages of qualification just to establish the basic facts often doesn't make the cut. This connects to something deeper in how historiography is operated as a discipline. For much of the modern period, historical writing, especially the writing of military and naval history, was dominated by scholars from the great powers of Europe and North America, working in traditions that naturally privileged the stories of famous powers, famous commanders, and famous engagements. The battles that appear in the canon are not there purely because they were the most consequential. They're there partly because generations of prestigious institutions decided they were worth studying, and that decision reflected existing hierarchies of attention. A battle fought between powers that didn't sit at the center of those hierarchies, commanded by figures who didn't become the subjects of major biographies, fought in waters that weren't the focal point of great power competition, was simply less likely to attract the scholarly investment that would bring it into the mainstream. And here is the uncomfortable truth that educators rarely admit. When the evidence is fragmentary and the scholarly consensus is thin, the path of least resistance is to teach the simpler story you already know. Uncertainty is genuinely difficult to teach well. It requires nuance, comfort with ambiguity, and an audience prepared to engage with competing interpretations. Famous battles come with ready-made narratives, established timelines, and decades of pedagogical refinement. A forgotten battle asks you to say, repeatedly, "We're not entirely sure," and in a classroom with limited time and a curriculum already stretched to its limits, that kind of honest uncertainty is often the first thing that gets left behind. So we've seen how fragmentary evidence and scholarly blind spots can quietly bury a battle in the archives. But there's another force at work here, one that has nothing to do with missing documents or biased chroniclers. Sometimes a battle disappears, not because the evidence is thin, but because something louder came along and drowned it out. Think about the naval battles that everyone knows. Trafalgar, Midway, Lepanto, Jutland. These names carry weight in popular culture far beyond the circles of professional historians. They appear in novels, in films, in national commemorations, on the walls of naval museums, in the speeches of politicians reaching for historical gravitas. And when you examine why these particular engagements achieved that status, the answer is rarely as simple as they were the most decisive battles ever fought at sea. It has at least as much to do with timing, with the wars they were embedded in, and with the figures who commanded them. Trafalgar, for instance, is remembered with an intensity that is partly about the battle and overwhelmingly about Nelson, a figure so carefully mythologized in the decades following his death that the engagement itself almost became secondary to the story of the man who died winning it. Midway is remembered partly because the Second World War created an enormous industrial apparatus of documentation, commemoration, and storytelling that no earlier conflict could match. Lepanto survived in memory partly because major poets wrote about it within decades of its occurrence and gave it a narrative shape that subsequent generations inherited. The lesson in each case is the same. What survives in popular memory is usually a package, battle plus figure plus narrative, wrapped together in some form of cultural output that keeps refreshing the story for new audiences. The battle we've been tracing through this video had none of those advantages. The war it belonged to, if it can even be straightforwardly called a war, did not generate a comparable mythology. The commanders who fought it were not subsequently elevated into national heroes, celebrated with statues and biographies and commemorative paintings. No major poet wrote an ode to the engagement. No novelist set a famous story aboard one of the ships. And crucially, within a generation of the battle itself, a different conflict or a more dramatic campaign came along and absorbed all the available attention. When later generations looked back at the period, they saw that larger event and organized their understanding of the era around it. The battle we're discussing fell into the shadow cast by something bigger, and once a historical event falls into that shadow, it is very difficult to pull it back out. This matters because it challenges a comfortable assumption most of us carry without examining it. The assumption that the battles we know about are the battles that mattered most. Scale, after all, is an objective measure. You can count ships, tally casualties, measure the length of an engagement in hours. But scale has almost no predictive power when it comes to what survives in historical memory. Some of the most consequential naval engagements in terms of their strategic consequences are barely known outside specialist circles, while battles that were militarily inconclusive are celebrated with annual ceremonies and national holidays. What determines survival in memory is not primarily importance, it's narrative tractability, cultural investment, and the sheer competitive dynamics of historical storytelling. And that's the phrase worth sitting with. The competitive dynamics of historical storytelling. History, as it is taught and consumed, is not an infinite archive where every event gets equal shelf space. It is a finite resource, limited by curriculum hours, by publishing economics, by the attention spans of audiences, by the number of museum galleries that exist. Every battle that takes up space in that resource is implicitly displacing something else. The great battles of famous wars are aggressive occupiers of that space. They come with established vocabularies, with existing infrastructure, with audiences who already know enough background to engage with a new detail or a new interpretation. A forgotten battle has to fight its way into a conversation that was structured without it, using sources that specialists find difficult and through arguments that take time to build before they can pay off. Literature and public commemoration act as force multipliers in this competition. When Victor Hugo describes the Battle of Waterloo, he isn't just writing about a battle, He's performing an act of historical preservation that no academic monograph can match in reach or in staying power. When a government funds a national memorial and mandates that children visit it on school trips, it is encoding a particular event into the cultural bedrock in ways that are almost impossible to dislodge, regardless of what subsequent historical scholarship reveals. The battles that lack these cultural anchors drift. They survive as footnotes in specialist literature, as entries in naval encyclopedias, as the subjects of academic papers that most people will never read. And with each passing generation that doesn't learn about them, the gap between those battles and the ones that are commemorated grows wider and harder to bridge. What makes this especially worth examining is that the obscurity of a battle like the one we've been following is not the result of a single cause. It's the accumulated result of many different pressures, all pushing in the same direction at the same time. The evidence is difficult. The scholarly tradition that should have studied it closely never quite developed the critical mass. The governments involved didn't invest in commemoration. The war it belonged to was later eclipsed by a more dramatic conflict. The commanders didn't become national heroes. No major literary work kept the story alive between one generation and the next. Each of these factors individually might have been manageable. Together, they produced something close to total erasure. And this raises the question that the next section addresses directly. Was the information actually erased from the textbooks, or was it simply never written in with enough force to survive? Because there's a meaningful difference between history being actively removed and history being steadily, incrementally, almost invisibly outcompeted, and understanding that difference changes how we think about what was lost and whether it can be recovered. That question, erased versus never written in with enough force, leads us directly into the mechanics of how textbooks actually get made, and what that process systematically leaves behind. Most of us absorbed our early understanding of history through a curriculum that presented itself as comprehensive, or at least as a reasonable summary of what mattered. And that framing is one of the most powerful illusions in education, because a school curriculum is not a survey of historical significance. It is a series of editorial decisions made by committees, constrained by time, shaped by what's politically comfortable, and guided by a fairly narrow set of assumptions about which stories serve the goals of education. Naval battles that don't fit neatly into those goals don't get cut after careful deliberation. They simply never appear on the list in the first place. What are those goals? They vary by country and era, but certain priorities are almost universal in how history gets packaged for mass education. Textbook writers and curriculum designers tend to gravitate toward events with clear national significance, events that can be connected to the formation of a state, the defense of a homeland, the birth of a political idea. They favor moments with identifiable heroes and legible outcomes, where it's possible to point to a clear beginning, a turning point, and a consequence that students can be asked to explain on an examination. They look for moral clarity, or at least enough apparent moral clarity that the story can be presented without exhausting qualification. And they need events that fit into a manageable chronological framework, building blocks in a larger narrative that a teacher can construct across a semester. The battle we've been following fails most of these criteria, and not for trivial reasons. Consider the question of a decisive victor. Many of history's most celebrated naval engagements are celebrated precisely because their outcome was unambiguous: one fleet destroyed or routed, one nation's maritime power confirmed or shattered, one strategic situation transformed in a way that students can grasp quickly. This battle's outcome was murkier. Neither side could claim an unqualified triumph. The strategic consequences unfolded gradually, and were entangled with events that had nothing to do with what happened on the water that day. That ambiguity is actually historically interesting. It reflects the genuine complexity of how wars and rivalries work, but ambiguity is the enemy of the kind of clean storytelling that textbooks depend on. Then there's the absence of a nation-building role. The engagements that appear in national curricula with the greatest consistency are the ones that can be framed as foundational or as existential. They either helped create a nation or nearly destroyed one. That framing gives a battle immediate emotional and civic relevance. It connects a historical event to the identity of the students being asked to learn about it. This battle cannot be credibly given that framing. It was a contest between powers whose modern successors don't straightforwardly inherit its memory, and its outcome didn't reshape the political map in ways that are still visible today. There's no constituency of students who can be told this battle explains why their country is the way it is, and the moral narrative is genuinely problematic, not just inconvenient. When textbook writers look for battles to include, they strongly prefer engagements where the reader can identify with one side and understand what was at stake in human terms. Freedom against tyranny, defense against aggression, a smaller force holding out against impossible odds. This battle's political context is complicated enough that any attempt to assign those roles cleanly would require distorting the historical record. The powers involved were neither straightforwardly heroic nor straightforwardly villainous. Their motivations were a tangle of trade interests, dynastic competition, and regional rivalry that resists the kind of simplified moral framing that makes history memorable to a 15-year-old reading a textbook chapter. Curriculum designers don't suppress events like this out of bad faith. They just don't know what story to tell about them, and a story they can't tell doesn't get told. What's striking, though, is the contrast between that popular invisibility and the way this battle has actually been treated at the academic level, within the specialist literature, in the journals that naval historians read, in the monographs published by university presses, in the conference papers delivered to audiences of a few dozen. The battle has received genuine, serious attention. Its tactics have been analysed, its commanders have been assessed. The strategic context has been argued over. Specialists have debated what the evidence actually shows, and have reached conclusions that are cautious but substantive. The battle is not, in other words, unknown to the people whose professional job is to know about it. It is unknown to almost everyone else. That gap between academic treatment and popular education is itself a revealing symptom. It suggests that what happened here was not erasure by suppression, but erasure by filtration, the process by which events that don't fit the templates of popular history get studied by specialists and then fail to travel any further. Academic knowledge about obscure historical events stays within a professional community unless something actively bridges the gap: a popular biography, a documentary, a novelist who happens to read deeply in a specialist archive, a journalist who decides the story is worth telling to a general audience. Without that bridge, the academic work quietly continues, and the popular ignorance quietly persists, and neither side is necessarily aware of the gap it's leaving. This is what curriculum design can do without any conscious intent to deceive or suppress. The people who built the history syllabuses that most of us grew up with were not trying to hide this battle. They were making choices under real constraints about what to include and what to leave out, using templates that rewarded certain kinds of stories and made others invisible. The battle didn't fit the templates, so generation after generation passed through school without ever hearing about it, and the absence compounded itself because a public that has never heard of something cannot demand that it be included, and curriculum designers responding to public expectations have no pressure to revise what was left out. What that means is that recovering this battle from obscurity is not simply a matter of correcting a historical error. It requires convincing people that the framework they use to decide what matters is itself incomplete, and that the stories it left out are worth the effort it takes to tell them properly. So we've established that this battle slipped through the filters of popular education, largely without anyone making a conscious decision to exclude it. But that explanation, compelling as it is, doesn't settle everything. Because there are historians, careful, credentialed ones, who look at this particular case and argue that the story of its disappearance is not quite that innocent. And to do justice to the question, we have to sit with that argument seriously before we decide what weight to give it. Let's lay out the competing theories clearly, because they're not all saying the same thing, and the differences matter. The first theory is pure accident. Archives were lost, damaged, or simply never systematically organized. Key records were written in languages that subsequent generations of historians weren't trained to read. The officials who might have commissioned commemorations died before doing so, and no one with institutional authority picked up where they left off. The journalists and pamphleteers who might have spread awareness of the battle moved on to other conflicts before the ink was dry. Under this interpretation, the battle's disappearance is a story about entropy, the natural tendency of events to fade when nothing actively sustains their memory. There's no villain, there's no decision, there's just the slow accumulation of missed opportunities until absence becomes the default. The evidence for this is genuinely substantial. We know that the documentary record for this period and region is patchy in ways that have nothing to do with the battle specifically. Fires, floods, administrative reorganizations, and wartime destruction have all taken their toll on the archives that any historian would need to reconstruct the full picture. The gaps in the record map onto patterns of loss that predate any conceivable motivation to suppress this particular engagement. When archivists and historians have gone looking for primary sources, the absences they've found are consistent with general deterioration rather than selective removal. That matters. It means the simplest explanation, things were lost because things get lost, cannot be dismissed. The second theory is deliberate suppression, and it asks us to look more closely at who had the most to gain from minimizing this battle's place in history. The strongest version of this argument focuses on the aftermath of the engagement. We know that the powers involved went on to negotiate arrangements that depended, at least partly, on presenting a particular version of the preceding conflict, one in which neither side's reputation was fatally damaged, and in which the terms of peace could be framed as reasonable accommodation rather than as acknowledgement of defeat. Under that kind of diplomatic pressure, the incentive to quietly allow the battle to recede from public attention is not difficult to imagine. Official histories written close to those negotiations are notably sparse on detail that would have complicated the prevailing narrative. That sparseness could be coincidence, but it's a suspicious coincidence, and some historians have argued it reflects choices made at a high level about what the record would and wouldn't show. The problem is that the evidence for active suppression, while suggestive, is not conclusive. Showing that the official record is incomplete is not the same as showing it was deliberately made incomplete. Showing that governments had a motive to downplay the battle doesn't establish that they acted on that motive in ways that can be traced. The historians making the strongest case for suppression are candid that they are working with inference rather than a smoking gun, and that candor is worth taking seriously. The theory is plausible, it is not proven. The third theory sits between those two poles, and it may ultimately be the most persuasive. Call it narrative convenience. The idea that political actors didn't need to issue orders to suppress the battle because the incentive structure of the period naturally discouraged people from telling the story loudly, and that silence, once established, simply became easier to perpetuate than to break. Under this interpretation, no official ever sat down and decided to erase the battle. But officials who wrote reports found it easier to be vague about what happened. Commanders who submitted accounts framed their actions in ways that minimized their exposure to criticism. Diplomats who negotiated the aftermath found the battle's ambiguous outcome more useful as an unresolved question than as a settled historical fact. And so a collective, uncoordinated process of downplaying accumulated until the battle had, in effect, been talked out of existence. Not because anyone ordered it, but because almost everyone with access to the record found it convenient to say less rather than more. This hybrid explanation has real explanatory power precisely because it doesn't require coordination. It only requires that human beings respond predictably to incentives, that people in positions of authority protect themselves, that institutions protect their narratives, and that the cumulative effect of those individual choices can look, from a distance, like deliberate policy even when it wasn't. History is full of examples where what appears to be a conspiracy turns out to be an alignment of interests, something more diffuse and in some ways more unsettling, because it's harder to challenge. Where does that leave us? Probably in a place of genuine uncertainty, which is itself worth naming honestly. The accident theory explains the archival gaps but doesn't fully account for the patterns of official silence. The suppression theory accounts for those patterns but overstates what the evidence can actually support. The hybrid explanation is the most intellectually satisfying, but that satisfaction should make us cautious. The most elegant theory and the true theory are not always the same thing. What we can say with confidence is this: the battle's disappearance from mainstream memory was almost certainly not the result of any single cause. It was the product of overlapping forces, some contingent and impersonal, some shaped by interest and incentive, that reinforced each other over time. The important thing is not to foreclose the question prematurely in either direction. Claiming this was simple neglect lets institutions off the hook too easily. Claiming it was orchestrated suppression demands more evidence than we currently have. The honest position is that the mechanisms of erasure were probably more complex and more human than either clean answer allows. Which brings us to the other side of the story, because if those forces conspired to push the battle into the shadows, there's still the question of what eventually began to pull it back out. And that story, it turns out, is almost as interesting as the battle itself. The process of recovery rarely begins with a grand announcement. It begins, usually, with someone in a library or an archive or a dive boat noticing something that doesn't quite fit the established picture, a document that shouldn't exist if the standard account is correct, a piece of timber at an unexpected depth, a reference in a footnote that leads somewhere no one has looked before. That's how forgotten history tends to come back, not in a single revelation, but in a slow accumulation of inconvenient details that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. In this case, the first serious modern efforts to reconstruct the battle came not from major research universities or national heritage institutions, but from local historians, people who lived close enough to the region to care about it personally, and who were willing to spend years working through material that the broader academic world had largely passed over. That kind of regional scholarship is often undervalued, and in this case, that undervaluation was a mistake. Local researchers brought an intimate familiarity with the geographic and cultural context that external historians frequently lack. They knew which municipal archives had survived relatively intact. They knew which collections had never been properly catalogued. And crucially, they asked questions that professional historians trained in the dominant narrative frameworks hadn't thought to ask, because the dominant frameworks had already told them there wasn't much to find. What they found when they started looking seriously was more substantial than the silence had suggested. Administrative records from the period port logs, supply requisitions, correspondence between regional officials contained oblique but consistent references to an engagement that had disrupted normal maritime activity in ways that matched no documented battle in the standard accounts. These weren't dramatic first-hand narratives. They were the bureaucratic traces of a significant event, the kind of documentary residue that gets left behind when something genuinely large happens, and the normal machinery of governance has to respond to it, even when no one is officially acknowledging what occurred. Cross-referencing those records with similar material from the opposing side's administrative archives produced alignments that were difficult to explain as coincidence. Then came the physical evidence. Maritime archaeology has transformed the study of naval history over the past several decades, and the recovery of this battle is a good illustration of why. When survey work was conducted in the relevant stretch of water, the same stretch whose strategic importance we discussed earlier, the results were striking. The distribution of wreckage across the seabed told a story that was consistent with an engagement of significant scale. Not a single vessel lost to weather or accident, but a pattern of debris that suggested multiple ships, concentrated in a relatively small area, lost within a short period of time. Dating the material was painstaking work, and the results came with appropriate uncertainty ranges, but they placed the losses squarely within the window when the battle would have occurred. Combined with the documentary evidence, The physical record made a powerful cumulative case that something consequential had happened here and had been waiting, quite literally under the water, to be found. Digital archives have accelerated all of this considerably. One of the persistent problems in recovering events like this one is that the relevant sources are scattered across multiple national collections, often in different languages, and the connections between them are only visible when a researcher can hold all of them in view simultaneously. For most of history, that was practically impossible. The logistics of travelling between archives, obtaining access, and manually cross-referencing material across collections meant that the full picture could take a career to assemble, if it could be assembled at all. Digitization has changed that equation dramatically. Documents that sat in institutional isolation for generations are now accessible to international scholars who can compare them against sources from the other side of the conflict in real time. Collaborative research projects, the kind that would have been logistically nightmarish to coordinate in the pre-digital era, have become genuinely feasible. The result has been a wave of reinterpretation in which familiar sources, read alongside newly accessible material, have yielded conclusions that were always latent in the evidence, but that no single researcher working alone could have reached. What has all of this research actually clarified? Quite a lot in some areas. The broad outline of the battle, its timing, its general location, the rough scale of the forces involved is now better established than at any point since the event itself. The question of how the engagement ended, which was genuinely murky, even in contemporary accounts, has been significantly sharpened by the combination of documentary and physical evidence, though not entirely resolved. We have a clearer picture of at least some of the commanders involved, of the weather and sea conditions they were operating in, and of the logistical situation that shaped their options and their decisions. But there are things that remain genuinely disputed, and honesty requires naming them. The precise casualty figures are still contested. Different source traditions produce incompatible numbers, and the archaeological evidence, while consistent with a large engagement, can't adjudicate between competing estimates with the precision historians would want. The question of who, in any meaningful sense, won, is still open enough that serious researchers disagree about how to frame it. And some of the most interesting questions about the strategic thinking of the commanders, about what they believed was at stake, about how the outcome was understood by those who fought it, remain areas of active debate where the evidence permits multiple interpretations and where new sources, if they exist, have not yet been found. That's worth sitting with, because it points to something important about what historical recovery actually is. It's tempting to frame Rediscovery as the final act, the moment when a lost story is returned to its rightful place, and the account is complete. But that framing misrepresents how history works. What we have, after decades of renewed attention to this battle, is not a closed file. It's an open inquiry that has moved from near silence to active scholarly conversation. The questions are better formed now than they were. The evidence base is larger. The community of researchers engaging with the problem has grown and diversified. But the investigation is not finished, and in all likelihood it never will be in any absolute sense. New documents surface. New underwater surveys become technically feasible. New interpretive frameworks allow researchers to ask questions that previous generations didn't have the conceptual tools to formulate. History doesn't reach a point where a verdict is rendered and the case is closed. It reaches a point where the current best understanding is clear enough to act on, and then it keeps going, because the past is not a fixed object. Our knowledge of it is always provisional, always subject to revision, and always, in the best cases, still moving towards something closer to true. So we've traced this battle from near oblivion back into the light, from bureaucratic footnotes and seabed wreckage to active scholarly debate. But there's a question worth pressing directly. Why should any of this matter to someone who isn't a specialist in this particular region, this particular era, this particular stretch of contested water? The honest answer is that it matters precisely because it isn't just about this battle. It's about what battles like this one reveal, about naval power, about empire, about the way history gets told, and about what we lose when certain stories are quietly set aside. Naval power has always been about more than ships and guns. It's about the ability to project authority across distance, to control the flow of goods and people and information, to shape the options available to everyone who depends on the sea for their survival or prosperity. When a naval engagement occurs that disrupts that balance, even temporarily, even inconclusively, it sends ripples through the entire system of relationships that maritime power sustains. The battle we've been examining was, on one level, a collision between two fleets. On another level, it was a test of competing claims about who controlled something genuinely valuable. And the outcome of that test, however ambiguous, had consequences that extended far beyond the ships themselves. Understanding those consequences means understanding something real about how empires work, how they project power, how they absorb setbacks, and how they manage the stories they tell about themselves when the outcomes are inconvenient. That last point is where the question of historical memory becomes impossible to separate from the question of historical significance. One of the things this case illustrates with unusual clarity is that what gets remembered is not simply what mattered most. It's what the people who controlled the channels of memory, governments, institutions, publishers, curriculum designers, decided was worth preserving, worth teaching, worth repeating, until it became part of the furniture of common knowledge. That process of selection is never neutral. It reflects priorities, anxieties, and interests that have nothing to do with the actual importance of the events being evaluated. A battle that complicated a preferred narrative, that didn't fit cleanly into a story of inevitable triumph or heroic sacrifice, that required acknowledging failure or moral ambiguity. Such a battle had strong forces working against its survival in public memory, regardless of what it actually meant, strategically or humanly. This is what historians mean when they say that historical memory reflects power as much as importance. The events that get into the textbooks are not necessarily the events that shaped the world most profoundly. They're the events that powerful institutions found useful to remember. And that means the gaps in our historical record aren't random omissions. They're structured absences, shaped by the same forces that structured the events themselves. Recognizing this doesn't require cynicism. It requires paying attention to who benefits from a given account of the past, and who is quietly written out of it. The invitation here is to rethink a distinction that most of us absorb without questioning: the difference between obscurity and insignificance. We tend to assume at some level that things which are widely known must be important, and things which are barely known must be minor. This assumption is so deeply embedded in the way we learn history that it can feel almost self-evident. But it's wrong in ways that matter. Obscurity is often a product of circumstance, of which archives survived, which victors wrote the accounts, which priorities shaped the curriculum in which generation. Insignificance is a judgment about actual impact and meaning. Confusing the two leads us to mistake the shape of surviving knowledge for the shape of actual history, which is a very different thing. This battle was obscure for a long time. It was never insignificant. The obscurity was imposed. The significance was always there, waiting for someone to look past the silence. There's also something worth saying about what recovered histories do to the histories we thought we already knew. It's tempting to treat a forgotten battle as an addendum, something to be slotted into existing accounts without disturbing their larger structure. But that's rarely how it works. When a genuinely significant event is returned to the record, it doesn't just fill a gap. It changes the proportions. It shifts emphasis. It raises questions about adjacent events that were previously considered settled. If this engagement was as consequential as the evidence suggests, then some of the standard explanations for what happened in its aftermath, explanations built on accounts that didn't include it, need to be reconsidered. Not necessarily overturned entirely, but reopened, examined with fresh eyes, tested against a more complete picture. That process of reopening is uncomfortable for anyone who has built scholarly work on the previous consensus, but it's exactly what the discipline of history is supposed to do. It's the mechanism by which our understanding moves forward, and that brings us back, finally, to the question we started with. Why was this battle erased from history books? After everything we've examined, the strategic context, the course of the engagement itself, the political pressures that shaped its reception, the documentary gaps, the competing interests, the mechanisms by which certain events survive and others don't, we're in a position to say that the erasure was almost certainly not accidental in any simple sense. Accidents of preservation explain some of the silence. So does the genuine difficulty of documenting events in the pre-modern maritime world. But the silence was too complete, too convenient for too many parties, too consistently maintained across sources that should have diverged more than they did. Whether that amounts to deliberate suppression, strategic neglect, or simply the accumulated weight of narrative convenience is a question the evidence doesn't fully resolve. And we should resist the temptation to claim more certainty than the sources allow. What we can say is that the erasure served interests, and that it held for long enough to shape generations of understanding about a period and a region that the battle had genuinely touched. The fact that it didn't hold forever, that the evidence eventually found its way back to the surface, literally and figuratively, is itself a lesson about the limits of imposed forgetting. History, it turns out, is harder to bury than the people who sometimes try to bury it tend to believe. So where does all of this leave us? We started with a question that seemed simple on its surface. Why would a naval battle significant enough to alter the balance of power in its region, significant enough to leave wreckage on the seabed and trauma in the documents that did survive, simply vanish from the histories that came after it? We've spent considerable time unpacking that question from every angle we could find. The strategic build-up, the fleets and commanders, the violence of the engagement itself, the ambiguous outcome, the political pressures that followed, and the long, complicated process by which the battle began, slowly, to resurface. Now we're in a position to answer with something more honest than a single clean verdict. The truth is that this battle wasn't erased by one thing. It was forgotten through an accumulation of forces, each of which alone might not have been enough, but which together proved remarkably effective. Some of it was deliberate. The decisions made by governments and scribes and chroniclers who understood that an inconvenient outcome, a costly failure, or a morally complicated engagement was better left underexplored. Some of it was structural, the documentary gaps, the fragility of records from this environment and era, the tendency of history to flow toward the sources that were better preserved and more easily legible to later scholars. And some of it was something quieter than either of those, the drift of attention toward bigger names, larger conflicts, more dramatic turning points that fit more neatly into the narratives historians were already building when they reached for examples. That last mechanism is worth dwelling on because it's the least dramatic and perhaps the most powerful. Deliberate suppression requires active effort. Structural loss happens beyond anyone's control. But being outshone, being crowded out by events that arrived with better documentation, more powerful sponsors, or simply more resonance with the questions that later scholars happened to be asking, that's a fate that can befall almost any historical event, regardless of its actual significance. It requires no conspiracy. It requires only that the field of attention is finite, and that certain events have advantages in competing for space within it. This is the distinction that matters most when we think about historical memory, honestly. Erasure and forgetting are not the same thing, even when they produce the same result. Erasure implies intention. Forgetting implies a process, gradual, cumulative, shaped by bias and circumstance, and the particular priorities of each generation that passes without asking the right questions. Most of what falls out of the historical record falls out through forgetting, not through deliberate suppression. But that doesn't make the result any less significant or any less worth examining, because the mechanisms of forgetting are themselves revealing. They show us what each era found worth preserving, which voices it amplified, which outcomes fit the stories it wanted to tell about itself. What this battle's long absence from mainstream history ultimately demonstrates is something that applies far beyond this particular engagement on this particular stretch of water. Historical memory is not a neutral archive, it is a construction, assembled from surviving materials, shaped by interpretive choices, filtered through the interests and assumptions of the people who do the assembling. That's not a cynical observation, it's a methodological one. It means that every gap in the record is worth probing, every silence is worth questioning, and every claim of comprehensiveness should be met with a degree of productive skepticism. The map of what we know about the past is not the same as the map of what happened. The gaps on one are not simply gaps in evidence. Sometimes they're evidence of something else entirely. And there is something genuinely important at stake in recovering battles like this one. Not just for the sake of historical completeness, though that matters, but for what the recovery changes in us as readers and thinkers. When we find that a significant event was overlooked, it invites us to ask, what else might have been? What other engagements, what other commanders, what other communities on the losing or simply the underdocumented side of history might be waiting in the archive dust or beneath the waterline? The practice of historical recovery is not just an exercise in adding names to lists. It's a recalibration of how we understand the past, and how cautiously we should hold the versions of it we've been given. The battle we've explored here was erased, yes, partially, selectively, through mechanisms both deliberate and accidental. It was ignored by generations that didn't know to look for it. And it was outshone by conflicts that arrived with advantages it never had. All three things are true simultaneously, but it survived. In fragments, in gaps, in the questions that didn't add up until someone decided to press on them, it survived. And that survival is its own kind of argument, that history is worth questioning, worth recovering, and worth refusing to leave simply as we found it.